To see you, Mike.
It's always good to be here.
And we're taking live calls 508 928 5255. 508 928 5255. Or if you are on our flagship station at Rumble, or if you're at Rockfin, you can communicate via text. If you want to send a text, actually, I would prefer you do it through Rumble, only because I'm looking at Rumble and I won't miss anything. Um, it's kind of hard to juggle all these things. And I'm still working on Odyssey, getting them up and running. That's a little more complicated because it involves Bitcoin, which is something that I'm not all that functional in.
Well, what about MSNBC?
MSNBC? Forget about it. Although I can tell you through a third party, I received a manual from the Southern Poverty Law Center. Let's hold that up.
Oh, the year
in hate and extremism. And this book has all the good people. There's some bad people too, but certainly. But all of the good people that could be potential guests. It lists all of the various live stream sites, websites, chat sites, podcast sites that carry quote unquote hate that are all, the real patriotic sites. I mean, people who are actually expressing opinion that doesn't goose step to the left, in other words. And so it's a great.
Who are some of the worst in the world?
I mean, it just lists Rumble and it lists Odyssey and Rockfin and all the good people that are carrying my show now. And it gives some good data in terms of Truth Social, Gab, Patriot, Subscribe, Getter, Parler. All these people carry my show. And all of these people, I'm working on developing the live stream so I can go. Some of them, it's not quite there yet, but, I'm kind of trying to coordinate the whole thing under one big umbrella so that all I need to do is press a button and everything suddenly, boom, it goes live everywhere. And I'm still working on trying to get Roku up. I don't know if that's worth my effort, only because Roku is so woke and it's so controlled by the left that probably if I do get up on Roku, they'll probably cancel me within 5 minutes. So I don't know if it's really, I'm not sure it's worth really my twisting myself over trying to get on Roku, although it would be a good thing. It's a good platform. So also, if you go on Roku, you automatically go on Apple, and Apple is probably even more averse to talk that might be alternative to the left. So, Mike, you've written an article about how Hamas is being cheered on by the American left and the American academia. And I just want to point out that this really transcends whether your position on the Israel-Arab conflict. You can take legitimate positions on that subject either way, although, frankly, I'm not going to in any way deny the fact that I'm a devout Zionist when it comes to Israel. You can argue the Palestinian cause, but what happened there transcends that argument. That was just a wholesale massacre of over 1,000 Jews. They crossed the border coordinatedly. They bragged about it. They were taking videos of it. And they went in and they murdered as many Jewish men, women, children, Holocaust survivors, elderly people as they could get their hands on. It was just that simple. They murdered I think it was the death toll is almost up to 1,500 people.
Right.
And if people can't condemn that, then it just shows how utterly depraved and sick this society has become. If they have to politicize that, they can say, we want to debate the Arab-Israel conflict, but we condemn this. We're not in favor of this action. And this was obviously something that was planned, carried out by Hamas. So, you have people now saying at Harvard that instead of addressing this atrocity, which is it's the largest single massacre of Jews since the Nazi Holocaust, and they just ignore that and they say, oh, well, we are blaming the state of Israel for this because we support the Arab cause and therefore Israel's to blame. All right, fine, but don't tie the two things in together. If they want to annihilate Israel, they can take that position. That's terrible, but that's what they want to do. But to try to do it at this time, when you've had this slaughter, and by the way, the very fact that this slaughter took place does, I think, give a pretty accurate picture of what would happen if Israel did give up the ghost. You think that this was a slaughter. It's so unsavory and so devoid of any kind of basic moral footing. And, to equate this with now Israel trying to end the Hamas rule over Gaza, what do they expect Israel to do? I mean, what would happen if you have Gaza's been there for 17 years and Hamas has controlled it, I think, for at least 15 or 16 of those years. And all they've done is lob missiles into Israel, tens of thousands of missiles, terror tunnels. They're flying over to try to get in so they can machine gun people. They've sent gas balloons in to burn the agricultural fields. What do they expect Israel, like any sovereign nation? I mean, you can't tolerate that. That's not acceptable. You can't live alongside that. So it's a war. And I think if Israel removes the Hamas infrastructure, maybe Gaza can go back to conducting itself as a Palestinian entity or whatever. I don't think Israel wants to occupy Gaza. Obviously they don't, or they would.
Well, okay, with all due respect, maybe you're overthinking this a little bit.
Okay.
The sympathy for Hamas that's been shown by essentially all the media, all of academia, is simply because, and I don't want to oversimplify it, but most people are very stupid and they would like to not go beyond what they learned in the 4th grade or the 10th grade or whatever. And since the Marxist philosophy was drummed into their heads from day one, I mean, one of the comments that I addressed on my Substack earlier today was the notion that, starting in the early 1960s, progressive education, so-called, took over. Very leftist bent. Here's the point. If you're going to insist, beyond all reason, beyond all observation, that you must view the world through a Marxist lens, then that's it. The Israelis are the oppressors, the Palestinians are the victims, and that's it. Doesn't matter what else happens, and that's it.
Well, it strips away any moral.
Because it's very easy to view, for these people, to view everything through that prism. So
no, I think you're right. The education now they started in elementary school.
Yeah.
It's teaching critical theory. It's teaching conflict theory, which they call in sociology. Everything is divided into two camps, the oppressed and the oppressor. There are exercises now for like first graders where you have to say, are you an oppressor or are you the oppressed? And they divide the class into the two groups. There's no option other than those two. There's no nuance. You are either one or the other. And it is a classic carrying out of the Marxist dialectic and they've decided to do it on these lines. And they put Jews and Israelis in the category of oppressor, mainly because, for reasons that are actually interesting. I mean, I think there are two basic reasons why they despise Israel so much and why they despise Jews, including a lot of very ultra left-wing Jews themselves. And those two reasons are because Jews believe in God, at least theoretically. Yeah. Not that we do, but Judaism advocates. Yeah, I mean, most people don't now. Most Christians don't either. I mean, that's been the world since the French Revolution. And we've removed God from public life. But the point is, the Enlightenment. But look, the fact is that Judaism as a faith, we believe that there was a creator of the universe who was the giver of the law, who is the one God, and there's no other God, and that God is not reachable or manipulated by human beings, that it is objective, it's outside of nature, it is the creator of nature. And the left despises that because they want to be God. They want to control what we believe in. They want to define reality. The second thing reason they hate Israel is because it's capitalist, it's successful, it's startup nation. It's a place that, yeah, they have socialistic elements, but nevertheless, relatively speaking, it is free enterprise. It's free market. It is a place where you can start a business and create something and build something and be successful. And you're encouraged, and it admires the merchant class. It's not an aristocracy. You can make it in Israel and work your way up. And so they despise that because that threatens their worldview, which is collectivist and which is distributist. So that's why Israel is, quote, oppressive. They don't give a damn about Palestinian Arabs. You know, the boycott movement, I mean, it put, I don't know if you remember SodaStream. It was an Israeli company.
Oh,
that
yes.
was, right? It was creating like kind of carbonated water or whatever they did. Very successful, all on what's called the West Bank. 90% of their employees were Palestinian Arabs. They were expanding, they were employing people. They were put out of business because of the BDS. They boycotted them. They were harassing them. They were throwing garbage at people who were trying to deliver this product. They were targeted, and they were put out of business. So who got hurt by that? Palestinian Arabs, that's who.
Oh, that's the point. It's exactly right that they don't care about the Palestinians. The Palestinians don't care about the Palestinians.
Well, their leadership doesn't care.
The viewpoint is just over everything. And to get even more generic, if I may, the whole thing with COVID and the vaccines was a similar sort of dialectic, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
You had authority and science. And then you had dissenters who may have been scientific as hell in their own educational background, but since nobody's brain seems progressed beyond the fourth grade, you have to listen to massa, who's in authority, and authority says so-and-so, and that was it. You would not believe the inane comments that I get when I write on American Council of Science and Health. And there are people that are saying stuff like, of course the vaccines work, and there haven't been any side effects. And is it a parody? Maybe
I've seen even worse than that, even in my own family. We love Anthony Fauci. Yes. I've never heard of any politician or doctor being referred to in that way. I mean, why they can't explain why, but it's like this sainted figure. And these are people who mean it because they've gotten multiple boosters. They've had COVID about 4 or 5 times. They've destroyed their immune system. They're wondering, and yet they're willing to march and goose step right into the grave because they're believing their government, and they will not deviate from that. I'm not kidding. It's like it's like a mental illness. It's sad in a way. And, look, I think COVID was a real thing, but I think the science was completely politicized by an agenda that sought to take advantage of it. It's kind of like what Rahm Emanuel, Obama's chief of staff, very famously said on one of the Sunday talk shows right after Obama became president: never let a good crisis go to waste.
Exactly.
And that's what they did. They took was probably a mild crisis, and they made it into an event that would allow them to scare the hell out of everyone. Everyone would basically give up their freedoms, lock themselves down while they kept their own select things open. And we'd be afraid. There were people who were afraid to step out the front door. I mean, I know people like this. You go out the front door to walk down the block, and they'd have the mask fully on, and you couldn't even put your finger under it, or they'd start to freak out. Or if they see somebody coming in the other direction, also fully masked, they would turn into a driveway and they say, You got to turn into the driveway and face away and count to 30 before you can come back out. This is outside. I don't really, I'm getting upset remembering the lockdowns because I
Well,
know
no,
people who
you
were.
can get upset because maybe the big question here
I mean,
is,
it's almost humorous looking back at it, but people went insane. It was
I,
totally
did they,
irrational
did
and
they go
totally
insane?
unscientific.
Did they go insane because they held these false gods in their
Yes.
head?
They believed their beloved government, and they believed this. Look, there was a massive and coordinated propaganda campaign that was launched on a worldwide level. We know this. We know it from emails that were released of communications between Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins. We know it because of Alexander's book, who was one of the insiders, who said that this was all politics. It was, they were like chortling and giggling over the thought of Trump doing a shutdown. They said, "Oh, we now have him by the balls. Once he does like you can get over the curb in 5 weeks. We've got him. We've got him where we want him." It was very political, and so and they were frightened by that. They believe Lester Holt. I mean, these are people who don't know. They're not. I call them the normies. They were scared. I mean, I'm seeing people even now in places like Brookline, and Cambridge. They're
Well, of
still
course.
walking down. Yeah, I mean, you can tell everything about them. They're still walking down the street in broad daylight, fully masked. I'm not kidding. And they're alone, and they're just walking down the street. I
Here's
mean,
my
first,
question to
yeah,
you about the mentality of the normies.
yes,
How is it possible? And I'm asking this in all sincerity. How is it possible that a normie went through his entire life and never once encountered a situation of corrupt authority? When he was in elementary school, was he wrongfully accused of something by authority? Did he get a bad deal from it's inconceivable to me that someone could have lived their whole life and authority was always right.
it's
How do you explain it?
maybe it's something that I think started in the 1960s when they began to work their way into the system. And people have, I mean, I know that it's an old fashioned word, but I'm sorry, I'll have to use it, brainwashed.
Yeah.
This is, we've talked about how the internationalist left learned how to manipulate emotion and mind on an international level. Right after World War II, they learned the lessons from the Nazis. They were brilliant at it. I mean, we've talked about this. They would
Well, the
have,
Nazis claim they learned it from us, but
well,
that's
I mean, I'm saying this idea of sensory deprivation and control. They would have these huge outdoor rallies. They would hold them at night, so you really couldn't see your surroundings. They'd use massive amounts of incense and smoke, which would affect the smell. They would use strobe lights to affect the visuals. They would bonfires. They would play blaring music over the speakers. I think it was Wagner, Flight of the Valkyries, and they would get the crowd. It's kind of works like casinos work. If you go into a casino, there were no clocks, there were no mirrors, there were no windows, and that they pump, certain incense into the room. I mean, I think, that creates a feeling. And they have noises. You hear the click, 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 and all the money falling. You hear coins falling into a pan, and and you eventually you kind of forget. You become dismoored. You forget where you are. You forget who you are. You become almost like an automaton. Psychologists have studied this. They've advised how to do this. It's not an accident. And the result is their goal in that case is to get you to spend all your money, because you start to get into it. You start throwing your coins into a slot, and you just, you get into a mind.
next time, right?
Yeah, and the Nazis perfected this on a social level. They were able to hypnotize an entire people. They were able to, the way Hitler delivered his speeches is something that has been studied ever since by world leaders. I mean, there's some that admitted it. Charles de Gaulle admitted this. Bill Clinton admitted it. That they would actually watch a video of how Hitler did this. he'd get up on the stage and he'd start very meekly. It's like, it kind of reminds me of James Brown, and at the end of the concert, he'd like be fainting, and his aide would come out and they'd put a cape on him, and he'd get up and he would, oh, and, there'd be this whole performance. And he would start off almost whispering, very soft. You'd have to like strain your ears to hear him. And then he would start to build, and then he'd build a little more. And then you'd have some arm gestures, and then you'd have the body language. And by the end of the thing, he was screaming at the top of his lungs and swinging his arms in the air. And people were fainting. Women were having orgasms. People were like passing out in the audience. And it would create this frenzy that I think is unprecedented, very studied. You can see this on the films that were made by Leni Riefenstahl, who was this brilliant documentary filmmaker. And, I think that they were able to do that.
Yes.
The what?
Triumph of the Will. That was
Triumph of the Will, exactly. And it brought the whole society together. They were able to introduce certain ideas that we're in this together. We're all Germans, and we're going to create this new order that goes back to the glory times before Christianity, when we had these Nordic gods, and we were like powerful on the earth. And there's this kind of like occultic stuff that came out of Theosophy, where you had the Aryans and these giants who had super consciousness, and they were super smart and beautiful and blonde with blonde hair and blue eyes. They lived to be 200, and they'd have cosmic consciousness. There were all these promises and all this kind of striving toward getting there, and the way to do it was to purify the race. And the whole package was bought.
We never learned a damn thing. So
the thing is that it's the establishment internationalists learned the lessons of how to do this. And they know how to manipulate the media to create these mass experiences. The Soviets did it. They had the Polytech. The United States did it through the MK Ultra at the CIA. The British had the Tavistock Institute. There were other groups that were involved in this behavioral studies. I mean, this is not an accident. And I think that the generation we have now are the products of this behavioral studies. I'm a product of it. It's taken me up to my old age now to debug myself sufficiently that I'm aware of this. But looking back, I can see that, I was very much part of this. We all were, to an extent. We were all hypnotized. We were all put asleep at an early age by these things. So I understand what people are. They're not conscious. They're not witting. They are, the idea is that there is no past, there is no future. Everything is what feels good. Everything is what satisfies the sensate. There is no God. It's all like in the here and now. The ideal is to try to be happy, whatever the hell that means. To find yourself, all those cliches from the 60s.
Do you think that any of this could have occurred if there were deep religious faith on the part of the people?
No, I think a major component of this thing is to destroy God. This is a conspiracy that goes back to the beginning of time. I know I often mention Whittaker Chambers. His book Witness, the first chapter, the letter to his children, it is a classic that should be read and reread by every high school student. It is great. There's some other good books like that get into this too. James Baldwin, who was a man of the left, his book, The Fire Next Time, gets into how Black people have been hypnotized. And there was some other, and I think he might have picked that up from Chambers. I don't know, but the point I'm making is that Chambers notes that in his day it was communism. That's what they called it. It's the world's second oldest religion. The oldest religion is, of course, God in heaven. Communism was a rebellion against God that took place in the Garden of Eden, when Eve wanted more. She wanted to see, she was tempted to to become like God, as the serpent said, who represents Satan, and essentially overthrow God in heaven. And that's what, in a sense, the secular left promises. We're going to overthrow God. We are God. We're going to create the universe. We decide what's real, what's true. And every generation has had to deal with this. Nimrod, who was the father of the world government movement, he built that tower so he could go to the top of that tower, pull out his sword, and cut God's head off, slay God, and become God. And all the people would be part of that. And that's why God struck the tower down and scattered the people below to the four corners of the earth with different languages so that they could basically begin the establishment of separate nation states. So every generation has dealt with this conspiracy, and I do use the word conspiracy because it's a conspiracy against God, and it's a conspiracy against man. It's a conspiracy against nature.
Okay, well, that's the certainly generic picture. But then you get down to this, and the New York Times was probably the worst offender, how they report the news in accordance with Hamas. And in fact, the Babylon Bee did a piece on New York Times has to have a Zoom meeting every morning with Hamas to see what they're going to put in the newspaper. So why were people surprised that the New York Times could do such a thing? I guess after Walter Duranty, after Herbert Matthews. And the other side of that question is the Times has been garbage for at least 80 years and probably dating back to the Civil War, to be honest about it. But if we only go back to the Walter Duranty era in the 30s, where it was pro-Stalin.
Right.
And we go to the late 50s, early 60s with Matthews, where it was pro-Castro. Why are people saying they're surprised? And more important question to me is, why do people still respect this rag?
Well, I don't think that people do respect this rag other than people on the far left. But the New York Times is the most influential mouthpiece of the establishment in this country and in the world indirectly. In other words, all of the news outlets in this country, the major ones, print, radio, TV, certainly the high-tech, the Googles and the high-tech, they all get their marching orders from the New York Times every single day. So the New York Times influence is well beyond its actual readership, which is predominantly in, New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, Massachusetts. It's beyond that. It's national and even international because of that ability to influence how we see things, what we talk about, and what we don't talk about. They're censorious, not so much in that they're blatantly leftist or blatantly, establishment left, but it's what they don't cover. There's a good book that was written about this by this guy McGowan many years ago, who, after he wrote the book and after it was published, he got such a problem. I mean, he was gotten such grief. He probably got death threats that he basically recanted the whole thing, and the book was sort of suppressed. But he really lays out the New York Times. He was in there. He was part of it. I forget his name now. McGowan, I believe. And he shows this. Look, you're right. I mean, they had Walter Duranty walking on, corpses in Ukraine, and with people starving to death by the millions, and sending back, bulletins about the great, you got to crack a few eggs to make an omelet, but this is the future, and this is the great, completely lying about what he was seeing in the Soviet Union, and getting the Pulitzer Prize for that, which is still on the wall at the New York Times headquarters. Herbert Matthews, you're right as well. He goes to Cuba and he finds this ragtag army up in the mountains of the Sierra Maestra, basically a bunch of guys with beards all starving to death. And he goes back and he says, this is the future of Cuba, and they're going to represent the people, and they're not communist. He tells
Yeah,
everyone,
they're not communists,
right, and promotes them with big front page stories. He had friends. He had a ally in the State Department, this guy Weiland, not to mention Eisenhower's brother, Milton Eisenhower. These were their friends he was working with them to try to promote this narrative in the late 1950s. And the New York Times was all over that. They referred to Castro as the Abraham Lincoln of Cuba.
Yes.
He was a nobody, and they built him up, and they said they were able to funnel money to him. Then you bring it up to the 1990s when they decided to normalize gay marriage, same-sex marriage. We've talked about this, regardless of how you feel about the issue. The whole thing was cooked up in the New York Times editorial room by Arthur Schultzberger Jr., who had just taken over the paper. And he's had a meeting, according to the late Ed Pollock. Ed Pollock was the editor and publisher of the New England Journal of Law, and he wrote a book about this. In full disclosure, I knew Ed Pollock. He contributed to my campaign for Congress, so I actually had some dealings with him. Not a nice guy, but he was right about this, I think. Where he shows in the minutes of this meeting that was held by Schultzberger, where he said, we're going to promote the idea of same-sex marriage, and we're going to market this as a civil right, and that it's very difficult to come out against civil rights. And he assigned Anthony Lewis, one of his reporters, to write columns to promoting this idea. That would come out maybe once every other week, maybe one or two a month, to gradually introduce this idea to the country. This was in like 1998, around that time, 90, maybe even earlier. And at that time, nobody was in favor of this, including most gay people were not in favor of it. It was unheard of, the idea that two men or two women could get married. But he introduced it, he promoted it. The New York Times used their influence to get other papers to jump on board. It took several years, and eventually they had a law case in Massachusetts that was decided in 2003 by Massachusetts Supreme Court, head of the Massachusetts State Supreme Court, Margaret Marshall. She wrote the decision legalizing gay marriage in Massachusetts, and that was the beginning of all of it. What was not known at the time was that Margaret Marshall was married to Anthony Lewis, the New York Times guy in charge of promoting gay marriage. All right? You want to talk conflict of interest. Anyway, we're putting this in the broader context of the influence of the New York Times.
So I guess my question is that if you went to a old-time stockbroker and he kept giving you bad advice, would you still keep going to that stockbroker? But the New York Times has been proven wrong so many times. I guess it just becomes a lazy habit for people that the institution keeps going, whether it's Harvard University, which now is a shell of what it was in the past.
It really has gone down, yeah.
But yet it's still Harvard. And the New York
Times,
is,
but I think that it's this whole recent thing has backfired on them. It's just not what it was. I don't think they expected the kind of backlash that they've gotten when they came out with this obvious propaganda statement about that Israel is solely to blame for this attack that they experienced. Again, if they want to get into an argument about the Israel-Palestinian conflict, that's fine. But to come out with a statement like that and to say that Israel is not only to blame, but is solely to blame, I think that I believe and I pray and I hope that, as usual, the left has jumped the shark. They've overstepped themselves. They've gone beyond what is obvious. They've made it so obvious that people are recoiling from it, including people on the left. I mean, David Pakman, I know I like to pick on him. He's a popular left-wing progressive guy. He's a rather dim-witted guy, but nevertheless, he's screaming that the left really isn't supporting Hamas. This isn't real progressivism. No, I mean, I'm like,
Well,
sorry
that's
to
the old.
sorry to
That's the old.
break it. Yeah, sorry to break it to you, David, but yes, it is.
Well, yeah, that's the famous
Yeah,
no true Scotsman fallacy, right?
right.
That someone's going to confront you with this. Well, no, he's not a real progressive. Oh, okay.
Well,
But if
that's what this. But at least he has a few scruples. I mean, that he recognizes that there's a problem in problem with this whole thing. I mean, he's so you have some people who are squirming a little bit on the left about this. I mean,
but not squirming enough.
no, but at least I think that there's some rumblings that show that they've jumped the shark. They've gone overboard. They've exposed their hand. Probably secretly, they don't wish Israel well. I wouldn't say that about a guy like David Pakman. I think he really is a Zionist, but a lot of them aren't, even though they may profess that. And they do want to see Israel destroyed for reasons that I got into earlier. But I think that Harvard, I mean, really jumped the shark on this one. I mean, after that letter came out, you had several people. I think Ackerman, he's a hedge fund owner. You've got Alan Dershowitz, a retired Harvard law professor, saying that we need to expose the names of the people who signed this letter so we know who they are, because they're supporting basically a Nazi-like agenda, the slaughter of 13,000 Jews, 1,300 Jews. And they need to be exposed, and then people can decide whether or not they should be hired by their firms. So
Well,
then you
fact,
had.
that's what happened.
Well, what happened is you had several groups back away from it and take their names off the list and say that they had, that they'd misspoken, including some pretty big names. But yet, at the same time, this radical group then doubled down, and they had a sit-in Harvard Yard where they're lying on the ground, like rolling in mud. Oh, these are like the most elite people in the world. That we're upset because Hamas is being attacked. And then you had a march on Washington that included several fairly large and well-known Jewish organizations of young people, which is really something that is a whole subject in and of itself, how that's happened. And they're basically conducting what you would describe conventionally as an insurrection. They occupied the rotunda at the Capitol. What's the difference between?
It was an office building.
No. It was the rotunda. I saw it. Lester Holt covered it. Yeah, they were inside the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol, and they were occupying it. There's no difference between that and the January 6th incursion into the Capitol. They were not there. They bust in. They didn't break any windows. They didn't have They didn't have federal agents. They didn't have They didn't have Ray Epps there. You got to go into the Capitol. And other feds.
They went in, and of course, the way they were handled compared to the January 6th.
Oh, nothing. Not even a slap on the wrist. I think a few of them might have gotten a minor reprimand. I mean, in the case of January 6th, I mean, Enrico Tarrio, who wasn't even in Washington that day, is serving a 22-year prison sentence. So, yeah, no, they didn't get any of that.
Well, what I, talk about the destruction of the institutions is just that obviously the legal system is completely broken. The fact that this idiot judge in New York can threaten to lock up Trump for speaking. But
I mean, that guy, he's a complete hot mess. I mean, I don't know. There's video of him when Trump came into the courtroom grinning with this satanic look. I mean, just, oh my God. He's getting such pleasure out of this, almost like he was just gleeful. And you look at his background. I mean, this is why in Georgia, I mean, I'll give you a comment briefly that Sidney Powell has had to plead guilty to a misdemeanor. She's looking at serving 20 years in prison. I don't blame her. You have to take care of yourself. She could die, and she's looking at what's happened to people who, basically like her, intoned opinions that were not popular, basically a speech crime, that are now being sent to the gulag. And I think that, from what I understand, the situation in Georgia is such that Fannie Willis, who is really a mess, I mean, she's totally disorganized, totally a nutcase. She's probably been replaced by, or at least being advised by, the same very sophisticated, very slick lawyers like Weissman, who was the head of the two of the Trump impeachments, and Elias, one of the masterminds between the 2020 election deal. They've gone in there and they're putting it together. They don't care about Sidney Powell, but they're doing this because they're setting the stage for eventually indicting Trump, and they're saving it for just before the election. They're going to pick, by getting her to plead guilty, and they're going to get a couple of other people who are being threatened with long jail sentences and who are scared for good reason. They're moving in on Trump, and they're saving it to have a crescendo right around the time of the election. So, I mean, I think that's what's going on with that. And it's very, very frightening. I mean, this is what we're dealing with in this country. We have people who are now being imprisoned because of their opinions. We have a situation where this guy, I forget his name, they came in and they busted his door down, and he was basically told, you have to recant and state that you do not believe that the 2020 election was stolen, or we're going to put you in prison. They just did this to Owen Schroyer. That's what that's about. They're looking through his emails, they're looking through his Twitter, and they're finding stuff that he said, years ago that they don't agree with. And they're asking him to recant, or else he's going to jail. He did recant. I don't blame him. You look at a guy like, as I said, you look at Enrique Tarrio. Look, it's easy for you and I to say, you don't want that to happen. But he's still going to jail for 60 days. They're putting him away. But the thing is that they're going after people like that because they're setting the stage for, I think, taking Trump into prison. And I think he probably will have to go to prison, probably before the election.
Well, that's all very interesting, but isn't the bigger point here that these institutions still have credibility?
Do they?
Much the same as Biden will give a speech that's completely incoherent, but it's covered on TV because he's the quote president. At what point, and I guess it's never, do people realize, this is all BS? I don't care that you're calling president. I don't care that you're calling this stupid broad the district attorney of Fulton County. This is all crap. It doesn't mean anything. Yeah, I'm not going to want to get in the crosshairs of that. But to give it any legitimacy in how it's covered is the greater problem.
I think you're right. I think it has lost legitimacy. I mean, it's obvious to more and more people that it's a scam. It didn't work the way they thought it would work. They thought that the first indictment would take Trump out. Then the second indictment, all it did was build sympathy for him amongst quarters that they did not want. I mean, what else can they do? It's not, and yet I think that this is their card. This is how they're going to oppose Trump. He's ahead in all the polls, the liberal polls in all of the battleground states. Can they steal it again? I don't think so.
Candidate on their side.
The what?
The thought, okay, fine. How do you beat it? Oh, I don't know. Create a good candidate for the Democrats.
I think there isn't this congressman from Minnesota, Dean Phillips, has already set up in New Hampshire. I think that he's running. You've got RFK Jr. running
as an independent.
But that's going to take a chunk out of the Democrats. I don't know. I mean, Cornel West, maybe he might pull a few votes from the far left. He's being denounced. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think that I don't think that they can rely on the election steal this time around. although I think that they may resort to it. They did it in 2022 in Arizona, right? That was obviously stolen from Kerry Lake, and they didn't care. I mean, it was in broad daylight. They just went ahead.
Well, the people that did the stealing took advantage of the fact that historically the courts have not wanted to get involved in elections for obvious reasons. So that's why it's so difficult to prove any of those cases. It's far easier for judges, most of whom are imbeciles, by the way, to come out with some nondescript, well, you don't have the standing, or
I wonder why that is. I mean, first of all, I would think that the judiciary would hear cases like that. Isn't that part of the separation of powers? Okay, Isn't that part of an independent judiciary?
Right, but take this viewpoint. What if all sporting events deteriorated into constant battles with the officials on every single play?
Well, I mean, they can be selective. I mean, but there are legitimate cases, and there have been cases in the past that have been heard by judges and decided by judges. 1960, there was a federal judge in Hawaii who gave the delegation to John F. Kennedy. It was originally Nixon. It was Hawaii's first involvement in a presidential election since statehood, which I think had occurred a year earlier.
59.
And this federal judge found that Kennedy had won the state, and he gave the delegation to Kennedy. I mean, so there was involvement by a federal judge. There are others we could point to.
Full of cases. There's that one. There's Bush v. Gore. There was one with Lyndon Johnson in 1948. But
and there were a lot on a more local and state level too. There were congressional cases, that go way back. I mean, it's not unprecedented. Generally, they don't like to get involved in politics. That's why they didn't hear any of the cases that were brought by citizens who had signed affidavits, and we're talking hundreds, if not thousands, after the 2020 election. They just refused to hear those cases, and by doing so, they handed a weapon to the Steelers, the Biden people, who could say, well, these cases were dismissed without merit. Therefore, which is not true. They were not dismissed. They never made their way inside a courtroom.
Yeah, they were never heard. Right?
No, they were never. The evidence was never presented in the proper venue, which was in a courtroom with a jury in public where you can have it adjudicated and debated. Never got that far. Actually, it did get that far in one case. And I can't remember the judge. There was so much going on at that time, but I remember reading about it. I think it was in Wisconsin. It was a state judge who did let it go in the room, and who actually said, yes, the evidence is quite clear that this was stolen, but I'm not going to rule on it because I don't want to be involved in changing the outcome of an election.
Well, exactly. That's the point.
If anybody knows that case, please contact me. I can't find it.
Yeah,
so I can't confirm it.
This was just like Obamacare and Roberts. I don't want to be the guy who overturns this.
Now, I also heard about, I mean, again, I can't confirm this. This is off. This is just remembering. There was so much information that in the case that was brought by Attorney General Paxton from Texas against, I think it was Illinois and Michigan,
right, saying
that those states changed illegally their election laws, which put our state at a disadvantage. The Constitution, Article 2, says that election laws are to be created by and passed through state legislators, and in those cases, it was done by secretaries of state, governors. They just changed it because they felt like it, without the legislature. And he brought this case, and it was a legitimate case. And I think he had amicus briefs from about 20 states. The Supreme Court decided not to hear it. And from what I understand, and again, I can't remember where I got this, there was so much going on. There was a meeting of all of the Supreme Court justices, and Justice Roberts screamed at particularly the Trump justices, that you are not to let this go forward. There is no effing way. He literally, there was a clerk who said he heard this from the other side of the door, screaming at them, particularly, as I said, the three Trump judges. And so he basically said, we're not going to do this. We're not going to get involved in this because it could change the outcome of the election as it had already been declared by the media, by the establishment, and we're going to go with that. So again, I mean, if anyone has information about that, please contact the show.
I had heard that story, but there's plenty of negative on Roberts. So
oh yeah, well we don't even want to go there, but there's a lot of rumors
but I have
about
very mixed feelings on judiciary getting involved with this, just for that reason, that they're very weak. They almost never make the right decision. So who wants them in there anyway?
Well, I know. Maybe I'm still idealistic about it. I still think this is supposed to be an independent judiciary that has it's not accountable to, political pressures. That they're looking at the Constitution, they're looking at the law, and once in a while they do. I mean, the rescinding Roe versus Wade is an example of that.
But how long did that take? And by the way,
I know.
If that's the case, why did Roe go through in the first place?
Right, but I never thought it would go away because of political reasons, and maybe it's because I didn't feel confident in the Constitution and in the process, but it did. So I mean, ultimately, the Constitution, at least in some cases, still functions occasionally in a way that it's supposed to.
Right.
Everybody knew that case was not constitutional, including the supporters.
That argument, it's correct in a hugely broad sense, but the fact that it took 49 years to turn that around, what about all those abortions that occurred in that period of time?
I know the millions of babies. I mean, it's
American
discouraging.
Council of Science and Health, science will correct itself eventually. And my response is always, well, I don't have 200 years to wait for that.
Right. And it may not. In some cases you reach, I mean, the IRS is supposed to be a temporary agency. Is that ever going to go away? Never. It's, I mean, it's been codified into law. It was set up temporarily by Ulysses S. Grant for 6 years. And after 6 years, it expired and it went out of business. So it became permanent only because of the passage of the 16th Amendment, which is direct taxation. That happened under shady circumstances, by the way. And it changed that was the year that changed America, 1913. You had the Federal Reserve Act, you had the 16th Amendment, which codified direct taxation. You had the direct election of senators, which basically gutted the power of the states.
Yeah.
You had rules in Congress which limited the number of representatives that could be elected. You had the beginnings of World War I. I mean, you had all these things come down the pike that changed the way America functions, the way America sees itself. And Wilson, at the end of his term, you had the Prohibition, which was the first time the federal government poked its nose into a personal social issue, that is the consumption of alcohol. These were all anti-freedom things.
Well, how cynical are you still about the fact that what may have permanently damaged the Republican Party is that they were in favor of prohibition and the Democrats weren't?
Well, yeah. I mean, it was marketed as like a moral cause. Maybe it was, but the point is that the federal government shouldn't be involved. That set the stage for the pandemic legislation.
Yeah.
The federal government can now poke its nose into personal health questions that really should not be regulated by the government at all. Or if it is, it can be done by the states through their legislatures, not by a federal power. Never was up until that point.
There have been numerous lawsuits against the IRS where
Right.
it is claimed that there is no federal law saying that you have to pay taxes. And
There
I don't
actually
believe there
isn't.
is.
I'm not. I'm too afraid to get into that issue.
Oh, no. I mean,
I,
you have the power of the government is going to get you is the point. But I've watched too much video on this, and you could see these live proceedings. Okay, tell me the statute, please. They can't do it. There isn't one.
no. Well. I mean, no. It's supposed to be technically a voluntary,
Voluntary.
tax filings, but it's the de facto law. And under Obama, the IRS. I don't know how much I want to talk about this. It's so upsetting. They set up a military arm. They weaponized it. They gave them military grade materiel and training, and it's basically become a paramilitary organization. And now under Biden, they're hiring about, I think it's 80,000 new employees, many of whom also are part of this military operation. So that to me is too unpleasant a topic to even think about right now.
Yeah.
We've covered enough. There's enough stuff to go over. I'll have to think about that one, getting into that. But it's an important subject. It's just a little bit beyond my ability, my
Your
thinking right
comfort zone.
now. Yeah, I mean, we'll have to. Yeah, it's another topic for another day. Anyways, Mike, what do you have coming up on the Substack?
Okay, well, we had the piece just came out last night on opening your eyes, and of course, we refer at the beginning of it to the play Oedipus Rex.
Yes, excellent.
Essentially, how sad is it to have wisdom if it gives no benefit to the wise, and this kind of thing. And what's it going to take to change people? The amount of surprise, so-called, where a lot of Jews are coming out saying, how in the world could these TV networks be so-and-so? And then I get into something that's even more cynical. In fact, almost too cynical for words. That it's not that the news media made a mistake by listening to Hamas. They knew that this was all crap, but it was all done for ratings, so they could gin up all this excitement, and that's it. They don't care about people. They don't care about anybody, because what have you ever seen on the news that's good and nonviolent? Nothing. It's all about destruction.
If it leads, it bleeds, as the old print media says, and that I think you're right. That's a big part of it. I think there's a bigger, sinister part of it, but that's certainly on the surface a part of trying to gin up clicks and likes and views and all of that good stuff. Anyway, Mike, as always, thanks for joining me. Great talking to you. I don't think I'm going to be away next week. I'm going to be in New York visiting my daughter. So I don't think I'll be around to do a show. I might be. I'll let you know.
Well, see if you can pull an exclusive one with Eric Adams.
Oh, yes. Oh, sure. I'll ask how things have switched so radically for him. Anyways, Mike, again, thanks so much.
All right. Always a pleasure.
Talk to you.
Have a good one.
Thank you. You too.